What events in history are taught completely wrong in your education system? NSFWBC history can be dark. Answer 1. Maybe not wrong but glossed over, but I feel like in history, in the US, we are taught a lot about the atrocities of Germany in WW2, but they never seem to bring up Japan and the horrors that took place there. Answer 2. Not exactly history class, but my Indonesian friend told me a funny story when he went to Netherlands and visited one of the museum there. Most of their Indonesian national heroes who fought against the Netherlands was displayed in the museum, but were labeled traitors or something along those lines. Are we the baddies? Answer 3. At least when I was in elementary school it was always heavily implied that Native Americans welcomed us with open arms and then vanished. We'd learn about settlers, but it was like they were going through empty country and finding places no one had ever been. Wasn't until I was older that I realized they just kind of left out a lot of conflict. Answer 4. In the Netherlands it's about the War of Independence in Indonesia. It is the most brutal war the Netherlands fought in, and the history books here mention it like it was just an uproar. Since the 70s people here tried to protest that the war was wrongly documented. However, to no affair the books were not changed. Recently a Dutch institute did an enormous research on the war, and they found that the Netherlands committed great atrocities in their former colony during the war, and the war was absolutely brutal and devastating on both sides. Now people are pushing to change the books again. But for some reason the people that write and supply the books are hesitant to change it because some of the soldiers who fought in that war are still alive. So the history teachers here have the duty of telling the students the truth, even though the book says differently. Answer 5. American here. Pilgrims land in 1620, then suddenly it is 150 years later, 1776. I grew up in New England, and it wasn't until I was in my 30s I wondered about what happened in between. And then I found out why you don't want to teach that to children. Answer 6. In the USA we never learn about the banana wars and US occupations of countries like Haiti, Philippines, Cuba, etc. I think because those wars are impossible to portray as good. When the US Marines murdered innocent people and let American corporations control the economies of nations in the global south. I highly recommend reading the book Gangsters of Capitalism by Jonathan M. Katz. Answer 7. German academic here. I had an Indian intern, student, first time in Europe. He had a great time traveling around Europe on weekends, and one Monday morning asked me, so France is full of statues of their kings, Austria too, Italy as well. Why have I not seen a single Hitler statue in Germany? I asked him what he had learned in school about Hitler, and it turns out that the portrayal had been along the lines of a great statesman, did a lot for Germany, eventually started a war, and lost, not unlike a German Napoleon. I'm wondering how much of that is anti-British sentiment. Answer 8. In the US I was only told the 20s was this cool time with jazz and prohibition. Nothing about the various countries we were occupying to kill rebels for the sake of corporate profits, or the Battle of Bear Mountain, the second largest armed revolt in US history. Answer 9. Kasinga Massacre in Namibia. It was an air raid on a SWAPO military camp by the South African Defence Force. 165 men, 294 women and 300 children died during the raid. It's taught as if the SADF just decided to kill a bunch of innocent women and children. However, what they fail to mention is that SADF warned SWAPO of the raid. They gave them the exact date and time of the raid and told them to please vacate the area as it will be leveled with the ground. The response from SWAPO was to invite all the women and children from neighboring villages to come and stay on the base with them, with the thought that hiding behind women and children will keep them safe. SADF delivered the air raid exactly on the date and time as they warned them they would. At least we have a public holiday now. Answer 10. The Algerian War of Independence. Back when I was in high school it was the very first year that this topic was taught in high school in an entire chapter. Before it was only mentioned briefly, except that it completely downplayed what France did there, all the atrocities, torture and more. It was seen from a neutral point of view and barely indicated that France actually lost the war and did not simply give Algeria its independence. I had to wait until I was in college to find the few French movies that talked about this war and described how awful we acted there and what we truly did. Even today it's barely talked about that we committed such atrocities, and not only in Algeria, but in our own country against the very same people. In 1961, a protest against an anti-Muslim curfew resulted in around 200 Algerians being drowned in the Seine by the police. And that's far from the only thing that happened. Some people that actively participated in this war are still alive today, and we barely talk about it. Except for the Algerians and/or activists which are very vocal about it but are silenced. Truly one of the worst thing France has ever done. We often talk about Spain, the Netherlands or the UK as important colonialist countries, but France also had a huge part in it that it often downplays. Answer 11. Slavery in the United States was far more vicious and bloodthirsty than it's ever discussed. There was a fiendish amount of molesting, impregnation and horrifying perversion going on. Slaves worked to death, rather than supply them with food or water when they were working in remote fields or other locations. Arbitrary murder, ambitious torture was common, just to prove who was in charge. All these things are very well documented, and in fact there were even interviews with ex-slaves that have been recorded describing these incidents. There's never been a movie or a story that was popular that went into these kind of details, and we look on slavery as something like what happened in Gone with the Wind, and we think people like Thomas Jefferson were so wonderful when he molested slaves and impregnated him and laughed about it and never freed them. Answer 12. Lenin didn't warn against Stalin becoming leader of the Soviet Union because he was too brutal. Lenin was just as brutal as Stalin. But Stalin was a bully with members of the party, and that was unacceptable. Bolsheviks should settle their political debates through discussion. This has led to the myth that Stalin betrayed the revolution, or that Lenin wasn't as bad. Terrorizing the population with mass hangings and summary executions was perfectly fine with Lenin, but you don't punch a member of the party because you disagree with them. Also, Stalin called Lenin's wife a fat cunt, so that probably didn't help. Answer 13. Grew up in the American Deep South, late 90s/early zeros public school. Slavery wasn't actually bad for the slaves, and in a lot of ways improved their lives. They came from Africa, a barbaric land with no civilization, rampant famine, warfare, etc., and were brought to America, a land of opportunity and plenty. Besides, it was their own people who sold them into slavery, not Americans. Families could stay together, you had a house, steady work, enough food, shoes, a close-knit community. What else could you actually want? Sure, you couldn't pick your job, but at that time everyone was a farmer anyway, so it's not like they really missed out. In fact, after the Emancipation Proclamation and they were freed, many slaves chose to continue working for their former masters because they were treated so well and had a good situation. The subtext, but explicitly said by the teachers, was that in Africa, they would not have ever known Jesus, and therefore suffered eternal damnation. By coming to America they were able to meet Jesus, and enter into salvation. Fast forward to modern day, and African Americans were better off in America than Africans still in Africa. So even if things weren't the best for some for a little while, nowadays the results are definitely positive, and the descendants of slaves are actually the lucky ones compared to those who stayed in Africa. Second place, evolution is just a theory but not proven. Honorable mention, not a single mention of the 1000 years of Moorish influence in Spain. Imagine how dumb I sounded the first time I went to Andalusia and said, wait, when were there Muslims living here? Answer 14. European education focuses on the ruling powers and elites, but it ignores many crimes against humanity that were carried out by them. In Europe, large areas were forcefully depopulated. Hunger was used as a political method to gain power. Forced labor and child labor were widespread. Children were taken away from their parents and used as child soldiers. People were forced to become mercenaries and then sold to colonial armies. Many Europeans had to survive day by day living, shack dwellings and slums, or renting a few meters to sleep on. These things happened in Europe until the middle of the 20th century. And let's not forget about the crimes against humanity abroad in the name of colonialism. Answer 15. I'm from Spain, and as all of you know, there was a civil war between 1936/39, and there were two sides, the ones defending the Republic and the nationalists, that ultimately went on to win the war. So when the dictatorship finished here in Spain, this war was taught as an easy victory for the nationalists, but while that was completely wrong, nowadays it has completely shifted to the other side. What I'm going to say, it's very controversial here in Spain, but most of the left-wing governments have been tweaking this part of the history to their side. Most people nowadays think that the nationalists just were slaughtering everyone who stood on their way, leaving people in the sides of the road and other similar things, but this isn't entirely true, because some people forget how many people were killed by the Republicans. And even worse, they constantly went into churches and killed everyone, even sometimes molesting the nuns and even some minors. Everything dictated by the Republican government. I'm not saying the nationalists were good people, as they did awful, really awful things, but I think this part really suits the topic of this questions. Answer 16. One aspect of history that is often oversimplified in education is the narrative surrounding Spain's colonization of Latin America. It's frequently taught as if the entire nation of Spain was united in the exploitation of Latin American countries, but this overlooks the complex reality that Spain itself was a deeply stratified society. While the colonies suffered immense exploitation and violence, the majority of Spaniards, particularly the middle and lower classes, were also enduring hardships. Spain was dealing with economic struggles, internal conflicts, and heavy taxation imposed by its own elites. Latin America wasn't just a distant colony, it was considered part of Spain, an extension of the Spanish Empire. The same elites who oppressed and exploited people in Latin America were also oppressing the common people in Spain. The colonial system primarily benefited the Spanish monarchy, the aristocracy, and the colonial administrators, not the average Spaniard. Recognizing this shared suffering doesn't diminish the atrocities committed in Latin America, but it does highlight the need to direct blame towards the ruling classes and colonial structures, rather than viewing it as a simple conflict between two nations. By understanding that colonization was driven by the interests of a powerful elite, we can reframe the historical narrative to focus on the systemic exploitation that occurred across the empire, both in Spain and its colonies. Note, I wrote in a broken English, I read it, and it was SHT. I used ChatGPT to improve readability, to deliver the message I intended to respond. Answer 17. Every education system I've heard of that will teach about the rise of Nazis and the Treaty of Versailles will basically accept the Weimar and subsequently Nazi myth, that the Treaty of Versailles was especially harsh or brutal. It wasn't, being comparable to the Treaty of Frankfurt that Prussia imposed on France, and being far less harsh than the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that pulled Soviet Russia out of the First World War. The talking point that the treaty was especially harsh was, again, cooked up by post-war German conservatives largely responsible for the defeat, especially the commanders like Ludendorff or Hindenburg, who wanted to continue their careers. The Nazis adopted those talking points. I also find Weimar Germany's history in general to be taught in very passive terms, only giving a few top conservatives like Hindenburg or von Papen any active role in the story. That specific part might be limited to UK's teaching of the subject. Anyway, it completely neglects just how complex the political landscape of Germany was in the interwar period. Answer 18. US and Canada downplays what happened to Native Americans. But even when they do, they'll write anything bad about us to justify why killing us was appropriate. But you guys fought each other, so it's okay. Not all of us. Yeah, some did, but most of us had trade routes and honored the land. We just wanted to live. That's all. But we were treated like pests and lead to, even when we honored the treaties, they just sign and make new laws to remove us because they wanted something truly horrendous. All land is stolen. We didn't steal from anyone. That's why we are called First Nations. When we arrived in North America, no one was here. Thousands and thousands of years gone, because people wanted property lines. Just sad. Racism is still alive and well. Answer 19. Also along Native American history here in America, we also were told most natives were simple hunter-gatherers who only lived in packs and were quite simple, when the truth is tribes like the Cherokee had established governments and trade with big cities that thrived on agriculture and merchants. The Native Americans were very advanced, just not on the scale of the colonists. Also, we were never taught about all the efforts to wipe out the Native Americans by the earlier colonists. It's never taught that here in eastern North Carolina from 1650 to 1750 the British and the Spanish were fighting wars and decimating entire tribes. Answer 20. Born and educated in Virginia. In this state, we are taught that Pocahontas and Sally Hemings were in love with John Rolfe and Thomas Jefferson respectively. Virginia history is only taught to elementary school kids and not to middle and high school aged students because young children aren't old enough to conceptualize the idea of consent, so they can get away with sterilizing the interpretation of what actually happened to both of those women. Middle and high school aged students would probably ask questions like, how would Pocahontas have even met John Rolfe in the first place? And how can we possibly know that Sally Hemings loved TJ when she also remained his property throughout their relationship? The truth about both of them is absolutely horrific. Pocahontas was being held hostage at Jamestown in exchange for peace with the Powhatan Confederation. While in captivity, she was brutally tortured and almost constantly molested by several of the Jamestown colonists, including John Rolfe. She also almost certainly became pregnant at least once before as a result of the molesting and either miscarried or the baby died shortly after birth. We know all of this because the English were stupid enough to let her visit with one of her sisters alone and realized she was telling her everything, so had to scramble together a cover story and get it back to Powhatan before word from the sister made it back to him. As far as Sally Hemings is concerned, we will never know how she truly felt because she remained a slave. Is it possible that she did truly love TJ? Sure. But because she was a slave the whole time, we can't say for sure that she was or wasn't, because we will never know for sure if she would have consented of her own free will, because she had no free will.